And hello, I just want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, Managed Metadata 301, Taxonomy, Governance, and Term Store Custom Properties in SharePoint. This is the third webinar of a three-part series following Managed Metadata 101 and Managed Metadata 201 in the last couple weeks. And today's webinar, just like last week, is presented by Wand Inc. and Term Management. And to introduce myself, I'm Mark Lair. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Wand. I have been working at Wand for the past 10 or 11 years and have a lot of experience building taxonomies, working with clients to help them implement taxonomies. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I've spent quite a bit of time learning and evangelizing taxonomy inside of SharePoint. And presenting with me today is Mike Doan. And Mike, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. This is Mike Doan speaking. I'm from Term Management. Term Management's been around for about 3 years now. We work on building and customizing taxonomies inside of SharePoint. We also do work outside of SharePoint, but the focus today is about SharePoints. I've been in the field about 20 years. I also teach at the University of Washington in Seattle graduate courses on information management, taxonomy, and ontology development. Mark?
Thanks, Mike. And just a little bit about Wand. We're based in Denver, Colorado, and we've been building taxonomies since the early 1980s through a legacy company, but have been standalone since 1998. And our business is providing clients with access to our taxonomy library, which covers most industry vertical topics and functional business areas. And what we do is we try to help people jumpstart their taxonomy development by giving them access to this professionally built taxonomy content covering areas that are going to be helpful for their business. The way we do that, this will be the very brief commercial part of the webinar, is through our Wand Taxonomy library. And if you have access to our library, you get unlimited access to the complete Wand Taxonomy library through this portal. And you can browse and download through any of those taxonomies into SharePoint term store format. So it's a great way to come in, have a library of content that you can use to bring into your term store to accelerate the process of developing relevant taxonomies and metadata models. With that, we're going to look at our agenda today, and before we do that, I'm actually going to open up and share the results of the poll. So the poll question is, do you have a formalized governance plan for your SharePoint implementation? 13% of you say yes, we have it, 59% say you're working on it, and 28% say no. So a lot to fold this into the agenda today, I'm going to start out by talking about the term store custom properties, which is sort of another advanced topic in the term store. We'll look at what the custom properties are and how you can use it. And the example I'm going to use is going to integrate some of the topics we looked at last week, including the content query web part and the managed navigation. So you can sort of see, we're going to have a new topic, but you'll see how that integrates into an applied example. And then for most of the webinar today, we're going to kick it over to Mike, and he's really going to talk about taxonomy governance in SharePoint. So the 59% of you who are working on your governance plan and the 13% of you who already have a governance plan, this can help you develop the taxonomy management portion of your taxonomy governance. And hopefully for the folks of you who don't have a governance plan, maybe it'll give you some incentive or illuminate the value of having governance for a SharePoint implementation. And then after that, we'll go into a question and answer session. So custom properties. And first thing I want to do is show an example of how I used custom properties and some of the things we've learned about in the Managed Metadata 201 to create some dynamic pages on this SharePoint site. And if you remember from earlier, the common thread of an example we've been bringing through these webinars is that there's a lot of content around this SharePoint Saturday events. And in the first webinar, we looked at how we create taxonomies to tag that content. And Today we're going to use the example of I'm running these SharePoint Saturdays now, and I want to create some pages for each of the events where maybe people can come and find information about that event. Maybe it's targeted towards vendors or exhibitors, whatever it might be. So what I've done is, if I click on Custom Properties, I've used Manage Navigation to create a term set where we're going to have some pages based on each of the cities. So here's North America, and I'm going to click on North America in my menu. And this is all metadata-driven terms. You're going to see that we have a page or a menu item for each of the cities in my SharePoint Saturday taxonomy. So we'll click on Cincinnati. Try that again. There we go. Okay, let's go back to Cincinnati. And what we're going to see is that a page comes up, and it's not the most beautiful page, but I'm not a website designer, but I just really want to show the functionality. But you can see it's a Welcome to SharePoint Saturday Cincinnati information page. And the first thing we see at the top are some of the key documents. This is driven by that content query web part that we looked at last week, or the dynamic content search web part, I should say. And you can see there's a couple documents that have been tagged to Cincinnati, so these are relevant. We're also going to see that we have the list of the city. We have the city population and a description of the city. So maybe those are things, some elements or some custom properties, as a hint, that we want to display about the city of Cincinnati. But I'm a vendor, and maybe I want to see, what information do we have about Denver? So I'm going to click on Denver, and what we're going to have is a page that has the exact same structure. We have the key documents, so I can download that sponsorship form. Here I have the city population and a city description. So now let's look at Atlanta, and we're going to see the same type of structure, except for there's no documents, and there's no population, and there's no description. So there's no documents because nothing is tagged. There's no population and no description because that's something we need to set up in the term store using custom properties. So you'll notice that each of these pages have the same structure. And the reason is this is all driven from metadata navigation, and each item is pointing to the same page. And the content on that page is populating basically based on the tags and the custom properties in the term store. So we're going to go look at that, but first I want to show you the page that was set up as a template for each of these menu items. So we're going to come over to Site Pages. And basically I've just set up a single page, the SharePoint Saturday template, SPS template. If you remember from last week, when you set up that Manage Navigation, each menu item is going to be pointed to a page. So what I did is I took all the cities and I pointed them to the very same page, which is this template. And if we edit this page, we can see the various web parts. So here we have the content query, or the content search web part, I should say, and that's the one that's bringing in the documents that are tagged to that item. And down below, we can see that we have what's called a term properties web part. And I'm going to show you how that works in a second. But if we open up the tool pane for the term property web part, you're going to see that it's set up to use the page context for the term. So what that means is it's going to look at that Manage Navigation menu item to drive what's going to be displayed on this page. You can do it that way, or if you want, you can go select a specific term from the term store. But to do it dynamically, we really want to use that page context term. So we're going to keep that. And then down here, you're going to see that it's displaying a certain property from the term store, from that page. Is it displaying the term name, or the description or the path or the ID. So those are all some properties that exist for this term, but what we really want to talk about is custom property. So you see here that it's set up to display the custom property for population. So if I close this, and then again we go back to one of the actual pages, it's displaying that custom property of population for Cincinnati or for Denver, whatever page we're looking at. And again, all we did is we set up the managed navigation for all these cities and pointed them all to the same page, which is set up to display content dynamically. So it's a really interesting, easy way to create a lot of different pages using a single site template or using a single page template and the term store. So that's how the page is structured. That gives you a flavor of the term properties web part. Let's go into the term store and show how that's actually set up. And we're going to go to the term store, and I'm going to go down to my managed navigation hierarchy. This is the one we looked at last week. And manage metadata 301. What I've done is I've actually reused my North America terms up from my locations term set and just brought it down here so it's part of the navigation structure. So that's an example of a term set that was used for tagging. I can come in and reuse it as part of my managed navigation. So we're going to click on an individual city, and we'll just go to Cincinnati and look at the custom properties. So the custom properties tab, when you click on a term, is going to be this fourth tab over. What you're going to see when you look at the custom properties are two options. One, you can do a shared property, and if it's a shared property, that means these are custom properties that are going to be assigned to this term regardless of where that term is used. So if we go up to Cincinnati here in location, you're going to see the same custom properties. Local properties, meaning it means you're only setting up those custom properties for the term in the term set that it's in, meaning it won't be shared across if the term is reused. But I've set them up just as shared properties, and you can see there's 3 custom properties that I've set up: attendees, description, and population. So we have these for Cincinnati, and I'm going to go show you how we would set those up for Atlanta. Remember, we looked at Atlanta before, and we didn't have any, nothing was populating on that page. So what I'm going to do is go to Atlanta, and I'm going to click Add. And this is the first thing you should be aware of with custom properties. It's kind of a potential gotcha, is that custom properties are not managed in a controlled way in the same way that the term sets are. So when I type in a term for a term set, it's sort of auto-populating. It's looking for what else is out there. But with the custom properties, I really just have to type it in. And it's not looking at other custom properties that other terms may have. So something just be aware of. You have to just be careful the way you type it in. If we wanted to create that dynamic page, we need to make sure there's no spelling errors, etc. So I'm going to go to description, and I'm just going to grab this from Wikipedia. And I'm going to add one for population. Let's see what that is, 447841. And then I'm going to add another one for attendees. We don't use attendees on the page right now, but I'm going to show you how we are going to use those. And we'll just pretend this is how many attendees were at the show last year. Again, this is a page that we're targeting to potential vendors or potential exhibitors. We want to communicate to them how many people were at that show. So as with anything in the term store, don't forget to hit this Save button. And let's do the same thing for Kansas City, just so we have a little repetition on how to create this. So we're going to go to Kansas City. Again, we're going to start with Add. Description. There's my Wikipedia description here. I'm going to add another one, population. 464,000. Now these are just examples of custom properties. You could really create whatever you want. Description is probably a bad example because that actually you can use the definition field that's already in the term store. One use case that we've heard was an oil and gas company that really wanted to create pages for each of their wells and display the properties of those wells. So what they could have done is they could have created a term for each of the wells that they have, and I'm just going to save this, and then created custom properties associated with those terms around those wells. So then that would allow them to create these pages and display information about each well or do searches, etc. So just one potential alternative use case. So we've set up Atlanta, we've set up Kansas City. Again, we tried to make sure we type these in accurately. Now we're going to go back here, and let's click on Atlanta, and hopefully we're now going to see some information populated for population and description. So that's just what we put in here. Again, that's using that term properties web part. And the same thing if we go to Kansas City. So now these are populated with information. So the last thing I want to show is how would we set up. Let's say we're now interested in expanding these pages. I want to show people the attendees as well. So I'm going to go back to this page, and what I'm going to do is down here go to Insert, a web part. It's under Content Rollup, Term Property. And we'll add it. And again, it says it's configured to render the context terms. We'll open up the tool pane. And that's what we want. We want it to display content based on our managed navigation term. But we need to tell it what do we want to show here. Again, there's a few choices. I can show the name, the description. Again, description would probably be a better way to do what I did. You could go to the term store, and instead of having a separate custom property for description, you can just use the description property that already exists. But just for the demo's sake, that's not how I did it. Path ID, but here we want to choose our custom property, and then we're just going to type in the name of that custom property. I believe I had it as attendees. We'll apply that, hit OK. And I'm see here, a little bit of space for a label. I'm going to just ignore the label for now for time's sake. So I'm just going to save this page so we keep our edits. And now I can go back here, and we're going to go to Cincinnati. And now here we have the number of attendees. And I would go back and change the page to say attendees, just like we have a label. But that's it. That sort of gives you a summary. That's how the custom properties in the SharePoint term store work. Again, a little bit more of an advanced feature, but we try to tie it back into how you can use those custom properties and the managed navigation to quickly create a lot of different dynamic pages and present a lot of information to your users. And with that, I'm going to go back to our slides, and I'm going to pass the microphone over to my friend Mike and let him talk to you about the importance and some methodologies around taxonomy governance in SharePoint. So Mike?
Thanks, Mark. That was a great demonstration, and I know that might be that capability for doing that kind of work that Mark just talked about might not be yet on your radar. I really have never had a client yet ask about that, but I do know that it's coming. And I think that's why this is in the 301 course, is that this is stuff that you need to be start to be aware of, because that capability is certainly coming down the road, which kind of dovetails nicely into this whole discussion about governance. And I want to talk for the remainder of this session about governance. I'll show you some ideas that we've got, and Mark and I are going to do a brief demo back in the term store to kind of highlight one idea around using governance. But this whole point of governance is that as we get more and more clients asking us about how to manage the term store and the taxonomies that we built once we build them in, the question kept coming up, and we wanted to come up with a cohesive answer, so we did. And we just put together some work around governance for the term store taxonomy in SharePoint. And when I talked to folks about this, I spoke recently on to the Puget Sound SharePoint users group about this same topic, and a lot of folks are coming up afterwards and asking. And I think that as governance in general for SharePoint evolves, that's why we asked you that question at the beginning, is that most folks are working on a governance model for their SharePoint implementation now, because they realize that as their SharePoint system grew, or as they maybe upgraded to 2010, 2013, they needed some policies and procedures around it. Otherwise, they end up with the derogatory term SharePlosion. I'm sure you've heard that before, where SharePoint is sort of left to everyone to figure out and to govern, and that ended up being a nightmare. And that's, I think, a lot of times why some folks are a bit sour on using SharePoint, is that governance wasn't in place and they were allowed to do what they want to do. And that sounded great at first, but if you've got teenagers, you know what I mean. A little governance sometimes is necessary along with that freedom. So we get asked about how to govern the term store, because that's what we do a lot of work in. And my first question is, do you have governance around your SharePoint implementation as a whole? Because I like to use whatever maybe someone in IT has already set up as a governance model. And that's always one of the hardest choices. What kind of model are you going to use? We'll talk about that in a second. So I always ask if something's already done. If it is, we would model the policies and procedures and a general governance model after that. If not, then we can start to set up a term store governance model that might be adopted by other parts of the company as they're looking around for developing a governance model in general. So we talk about search and navigation and integrating the term store, and it has a lot of great capabilities. Like many other things in SharePoint, you could do a lot of cool stuff with it. Mark just showed one. Last week we talked about a lot more capabilities. I know we jam-packed a lot of topics into 1 hour last week, and a couple of folks were saying we try to do too much, but that's why this is recorded, so you can go back and review it later, and it gives you a chance to catch what you didn't catch the first time. But the key point here about governance is that in order to govern your SharePoint implementation, you need policies and procedures. In order to govern your taxonomy inside of SharePoint, your term store, you need the same thing. And so what we set out to do, and what we accomplished, and what we help our clients with, is how to do this. And so we don't want the typical growth without governance, growth without control in term store. Many things can go wrong with the term store. If you've tried to build out a term store already without governance, and then you started to show other people who got very excited and wanted to go do their own thing. We've had cases where we've been working with one group in a company to do governance, and then somebody else heard about it and said, "Hey, can we do that for a while?" And they did. And what happened was you ended up with a lot of conflicting terms. You ended up with a lot of people using their own terms rather than a standard term across the company, and they ended up right back where they were, which was basically a mess. And so search didn't work well because you didn't have control over your terms. You didn't integrate the terms stats necessarily with search correctly, and so everybody ended up, again, with a bigger mess than when you started with. So that's the whole point of governance, is that try to get a handle on this early, and you don't need to do a whole bunch of work. I mean, that's kind of one of the other things we tell clients is who are afraid, do we need a year to set up governance, and do we need a whole big governance plan in place before the term store gets put into governance? And I say, no, I mean, start with the term store at the very least, and start with 10 policies, and I'll show you those policies a little bit later to start with. I mean, that's all you really need to get it going. And once everybody understands that there's a governance policies, plans in place, it tends to help, temper the growth, and also gives people guidance on how to build this up. Most of the clients we work with do not have a taxonomist in place. They do not necessarily have a trained taxonomists who can come in and set, help set standards. They really just have somebody who got either missed a meeting where they assigned taxonomy governance or taxonomy responsibility, and then they ended up being assigned it. Oftentimes it's an IT person. Oftentimes it's somebody who's maybe like a business analyst or information architect, for example, who sort of knows what it's about but doesn't really know and needs some help. And the point is that if you have some policies and procedures in place to help them, they'll feel a little bit more confident in going out and starting to do this work. And you really want to have that. I think the key phrase here is curated growth. You want to have a curated growth, a plan to do curated growth across your entire company. Most of the clients we work with do not want us to do an entire taxonomy for their entire organization all at once. It would just take too long. So we typically start with one group. Typically it's like someone in maybe in HR. That's one of the easiest groups to start with because they're the ones that have the most controlled set of terms that we could come up with. In addition, it's a pretty solid foundation of people who kind of know what they're doing with their jobs. And also, HR touches everybody in the company. So it really is a good place to start, and we oftentimes start with HR. But we quickly move out into sales and legal and other areas. So if you've got that curated growth set up in advance, it can really give you the head start that you need. So go to the next slide, Mark. And so here's a 4-step process that we typically use going into this. So first we want to define that governance model. And I'll talk about these 3 different models in the next few slides. And there's pros and cons to each one of them. If you kind of have a general sense of how you want to control your SharePoint implementation overall, you'll probably follow that same model here with your governance, whether it's centralized, decentralized, or autonomous. And again, there's pros and cons to each, and we'll talk about that with regard to the term store, the taxonomy. But step 1, figure out how you want to govern your SharePoint site, and then vis-a-vis your term store as well. Step 2, what are your governance roles? Sometimes companies have just one person, 1 or 2 people, maybe in IT, who are defining governance. But oftentimes they're defining governance with relationship to number of servers and load balance and access rights and things like that. And there's no way that those folks in IT are even interested, for the most part, in going down to the taxonomy level to do this. I've never yet met an IT person who said, I can't wait to get started on doing governance for taxonomies. It just doesn't happen. So oftentimes it ends up being one person, maybe a few people, and maybe you can get a few people together to recruit it to do make a committee for this. But oftentimes this comes back to 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 people who are going to do this for the company, and that's not a full-time role, obviously. But at least at some point you're going to define some governance roles for who really is going to be in charge of the taxonomy. And we'll talk later about what those roles are. This process to do it, step 3, how are you going to manage the taxonomy? Is it going to be a simple thing where you just let everybody add their own keywords and tags and use enterprise keywords? Hey, there's pros and cons to that. I'm as a trained taxonomist, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of folksonomies and allowing people to do that, but there's value to it. I get that, but you got to figure out how are you going to manage the process for making change, and is there a process you're going to set up that says twice a year we'll go through and review all candidate terms and make updates, or do we do it based on somebody screaming loudly? That some places are like that. Whoever screams the loudest gets the attention and the work gets done. But still, there needs to be an established process in place in advance. Otherwise, it can get pretty chaotic. And also, there's no record of how changes were made, and that can oftentimes lead to disaster later. As in, why did we make this decision 8 months ago to change this term, and no one has a record of it? And I think having that change management process in place is massively important. And the last step 4, is just what are the policies? Out of all this thinking about the model and the roles and the process, the change process, you still need to have the policies. And these are typically just written out in Word, and there's a template you can use, and I'll show you a bit of that. And you can just track stuff. It's not a lot of work once it's set up. The setup does take some effort, but once it's in place, you tend to kind of fall back on these things, and it's easier. And the other point is that it's safer. What I mean by that is, one of my, I don't know, mantras, I guess, coming into this with regard to taxonomy is like, in companies, nobody cares until somebody cares, and then everybody cares. And that, that's typical. I realize that applies to a lot of other things. But with taxonomy, no one really cares about it, or maybe a few people. And then once it's sort of put in place, and we've seen cases where people get very possessive about their terms and their terminology for their group, and they don't want to share it or have everybody else use it, or they're adamant about this. We define that term this way in our company. We have for the last 20 years, and on and on. So you really have to have some policies in place, and all of this work really just makes it easier to fall back on. Well, we have a policy for changing a term, and here it is, or we have a policy for updating a term or deleting a term, rather than on an ad hoc basis making it up as you go. It's just a lot easier. I think you get that. You understand that. That's why you're here listening about governance. But the point is, where do you start? Every client we have says, where do we start with governance? And this is where we start. We do these 4 steps, and then we'll go to the next slide, Mark, if you will, please. And we'll start talking about, the model. So, this is a pretty simplified model. I understand that. But basically what we're saying here is that we've got a taxonomy team, and again, this might be 1 or 2 people, more likely, who sort of have a control over the taxonomy at the root level, at the enterprise level, and you can assign out or let different teams, different groups use that taxonomy or their term set as they see fit, but you still really have a kind of a core group controlling how all of the taxonomies get used across the company. This is great if you can have somebody who's really into it, and it's maybe a part of their job, 1 or 2 hours a week. They work on the term store, and they manage the taxonomy, and they get feedback, and they make some changes, and they're really into it. And all the stuff we talked about that last week and earlier today, if you want to do stuff like that, you really want to have someone who's sort of knowledgeable of what the impact would be to the company if you started to do this. You don't want people just randomly starting to go off and do managed properties or this other kind of managed navigation without some control over it. So this is kind of a model where a core team helps other teams across the company understand the value of using the taxonomy, maybe helps them build out a term set. They could build it in Excel, import it as a CSV, and they get their own term set up and running, but there's still some kind of central control over it. And if this is more, I guess you could say more advice and help if something goes wrong, rather than a strict, you must jump through these 8 hoops to get a term spelling changed. So, that's hard to do, and I realize that may be the dream of some burgeoning taxonomists out there, but in reality in SharePoint, it doesn't necessarily do a lot of productivity. So here you see where, you might have an HR team that has a term set, and then they maybe have a category, subcategories for benefits, recruiting that they're managing. But at the core is that you've got a team that understands how taxonomy is used across the entire enterprise and helps and assists with building it out. The next slide is more of a decentralized model where the team maybe sets up an enterprise taxonomy at the root that is then shared, but realistically there's somebody like a lead person in a group that does most of the work for that group. And maybe HR has a person that's really into it, and they're really managing their own term set. They might be borrowing from the enterprise taxonomy, but they're not necessarily getting a lot of advice from that core taxonomy group. They know what they're doing, and they'll go ahead and they'll do it, and they'll manage it. They might stop in there a couple times a year and make some updates and things like that. But on the whole, the taxonomy is not necessarily self-sustaining, but there's less control from a central model that you might borrow terms here and there, and somebody like on the HR lead or the sales lead understands what's in the enterprise taxonomy and might use terms here or there, reuse terms, or maybe pin some terms. But for the most part, each of these groups are somewhat independently producing their own term sets and controlling their own destiny with how their content is being tagged or their lists are being tagged. But they know that in the end, they've got to work on it themselves. Their HR, they've got to come up with their own modifications to terms, and they understand that. And they might once in a while feed some information back into the enterprise taxonomy. But the goal here is that, look, we don't use that. We don't share many terms in our company between groups, and we're happy just to set up our own control here for our own term sets that we want to control. We can look at what other people are doing, across the enterprise, but we're not really depending on someone to help us guide us through this, massive integration to a larger enterprise taxonomy. And the third model sounds scary, and it also sounds like it's really not the best way to go. Some companies can manage this, and I think in this case is that we just set up an enterprise taxonomy that, as Mark was talking about, maybe a want taxonomy that could be set up that'll get to 80% of what most of these groups are going to use. But the reality is these groups are going to set up their own and manage their own taxonomies, maybe at the site collection level, not even at that root level, and there's not a lot of control. That doesn't mean that everything's going to run wild. This is a case where if you go down this model, where HR and operations and IT are basically running their own show for their own taxonomy purposes, they can still use the policies and procedures that were set up in the enterprise to manage their own. So there's going to be some good advice, tips, and tricks in there. But still, the notion is, and this is a case sometimes where IT can set up the enterprise taxonomy, enable it for these groups, and then it's hands off.
So Mike, just to jump in, a question maybe that's in people's minds, you've given us 3 models. How do you know which one makes the most sense for your organization? How would someone choose between these models?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. And I think that when everyone asks me that, I go back to that first slide where we talk about step 1, which is how do you govern your SharePoint implementation now outside of the term store. If you have a centralized model, I would say use the centralized model. If you've got decentralized or autonomous, go that direction. That's why I always ask first, what's the flavor of your company's governance right now? Many companies say, we don't even have governance. We have no idea. And that's where we could come in and sort of help out by doing some interviews, to interview IT people and other folks who are deeply involved in SharePoint and try to get a sense of how you're going to do your governance model. And then we could echo that sentiment, so to speak, in designing the term store governance model. And then the assumption is, of course, that would perhaps help establish your larger governance model across the entire implementation. Not saying it will, because there's a lot of things, of course, that aren't covered in a governance model for a term store that would be covered elsewhere in SharePoint, but that decision is more or less trying to figure out what the characteristic of your company is, and then echoing that down into the governance model for your term store. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Mark. Yeah. So moving forward, what kind of people are involved in this? So, in an ideal world, you have this like super taxonomy person who knows all about SharePoint and taxonomy and can really start to manage, what you're doing with your term store and with regard to the rest of your site collections and all your sites in SharePoint. And that's a pretty big job. And we rarely run across a company that's got a dedicated full-time taxonomist working in SharePoint. And so that's a dream state. Typically, we've got someone who's more of a part-time. Like I said, I can spend 2 hours a week on the term store, and that's probably about it. And give me some help. And we think that the governance model we set up can help them. Sometimes we get a team, though, and we like this when we go to do an implementation. We can get a few people, maybe, like I said, one from HR, one from sales, one from engineering, ops, whatever it happens to be, and they kind of get it. And they will help to monitor it amongst their team. It's of course a dream to have one person from every division, every group, every business unit. That's a dream. That's rarely realized. But if you can get a few folks together who can start thinking about how to use taxonomy, it does tend to help spread the word a little quicker across the organization. It's not a big deal. We typically don't ask people to commit more than say a couple hours a month to working on this, but with a group effort, oftentimes it could be a lot easier to maintain the taxonomy because you get a little feedback and you get some pushback. I like to set up a team site, for taxonomy governance when we come in and work on implementation with clients. That's sort of then they realize, okay, there's one place I can go to get some policies or to talk to other folks, or we could set up an email alias to go to Taxo governance, and all the email gets sent to that team site, so we can kind of track what we're doing, or if we have questions, and that works out pretty well. It's just a storage place for all your policies and procedures, and also for people to understand if they want to have a question or answered, or if they want to communicate something about. Maybe we can set up a meeting, twice a year to go to this meeting, and you can calendar it inside of this team site. I'd like to set up a team site for that. With the committee, that's a little more formal, and I think that's more, some companies like that formality. We have clients in pharma and also in legal who want to have a little bit more control over that, and they'll set up a committee that will meet to monitor and maintain the taxonomy.
So Mike, a question we sometimes get is, especially for organizations who are starting with taxonomies, and like you said, they really don't have a taxonomist, but they know they need the governance. How do you identify the right person or the right people to fulfill these roles? Is there job titles or the characteristics? Is it just
I think there are. Yeah, you're typically not going to have a taxonomist, but you might have an information architect. You might have a business analyst. You might have somebody who's working on search and analytics who might know about this type of thing. You might have someone in IT who's very familiar with this. I mean, when you start talking about, the core roots of taxonomy, and you start talking about linked data, you start talking about that kind of thing, you might have somebody from IT or who's involved in search who's very interested in it, who might have the sort of the understanding of how this works within SharePoint and be able to point it out. So I typically look for those kinds of folks. And I'll tell you something else, Mark. One of the typical roles that we see assigned to this is what could typically be called an admin assistant, where there's somebody who's like the admin assistant for HR, who sort of understands the lay of the land of how the group or the business unit works. Oftentimes they're the person who, without formal training most of the time, can go in and do this kind of work with some help, and whether that's the committee or some governance plan. So we have had admin assistants go in and do this work very successfully with certain companies. And, you kind of have to figure this out for your own company. Rarely do you have one person. Typically you'll have a team, and rarely will you have a committee, but those are kind of the success factors that we've seen anyway when we do this kind of work.
Okay. And someone commented on the questions panel that a corporate librarian is a great choice. I think that's true as well if you're lucky to have one on staff.
Exactly. So typically larger companies would have a corporate librarian. One of the things, I'm obviously coming from a library background as I do in LIS, I love corporate librarians, but fewer and fewer companies have them. One of the challenges that we've seen with corporate librarians on projects is either perhaps a corporate librarian isn't necessarily familiar with SharePoint, and so there might be some a learning curve on that. And this is with regard to corporate librarians, is that this isn't exactly librarian 101. This is not really library science per se. We're really talking about tagging and search and findability and IA, and there's a lot that goes into it. And some librarians necessarily aren't interested in it. But if you've got a librarian who does understand SharePoint and really gets how this is done, that would be the go-to person for me. And that's fantastic. We just rarely see them. So those are special people.
Good.
Thanks. Next, please. Updates. So we're talking about updates. We typically recommend to start out with updating it twice a year. People get freaked out when they say, do we have to update this, once a week? And I'm like, no, really, you can just think about doing it twice a year. Now, could you do it more often? Absolutely. But when I say twice a year, typically that's as long as it takes to get a collection of requests / needs collected to go do the updates. And it's a lot easier to do updates in bulk, we've found, rather than one-off, because you can kind of start to see some relationships and also make decisions from a collection of requests rather than just one-off requests. Because when you're doing one-off requests, oftentimes you don't quite realize yet what the impact would be. But, again, depends on how you got this set up. We like to use user feedback. And, Mark, I think you talked last week about, term sets can be set up to have an owner, and you can have the ability to ping an owner via email to say, hey, why don't you update this term set with this term? Mm-hmm. We might have covered that last week. But anyway, I think user feedback is important here. Yep. And then last is modify as necessary. So sometimes we'll have cases where like a marketing group will come in and say, hey, we have a campaign coming, we're going to add a bunch of terms to some content on web pages, and we want to have these tags in there, so can you add this? And then, of course, you would go out and try to create the term set based on what you've already got or what they're needing. But, these are three of the kind of different ways that you'll typically see changes with updates in the term store. And also, I got a really lightweight, line there on the bottom, steps, where you get a suggestion, it gets submitted, a few people review it, they can vote on. This is a dream state, by the way. Typically, it's just like someone complains really loudly, someone goes and fixes it, and then it's done. But we hope that you at least got some process and procedures in there when you're doing that, that sort of ad hoc updates to control it. So we go next. Here we go with some, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can read through these. We've got 5 on each slide here. So we found that these are pretty much the top 10 policies you're going to need right off the bat, because these are the kind of things you're going to do right away or be asked to do as a taxonomy manager. And I think Mark has highlighted number 5 there. We could jump to that real quick.
Yes, yeah, so let's kind of do a review, Mike, of what the difference is in reusing versus pinning versus copying a term set. And as we do that, if you can give a little color commentary on why would you decide to do either these three, choose amongst these 3 options. That's something that really would be driven by your governance policy, correct?
Correct, yeah. So if you're going to change it, if you want to reuse a term, you want to have a policy around that, because reusing a term is not the same thing as pinning a term, and it's not the same thing as creating a new term with the same label. So there's 3 tricky, and it can get tricky. Reusing a term is probably the easiest. You can see here Europe has been reused. And if you click on it and scroll to the bottom, you can kind of see where it comes from, the source of it. But the idea here is that if I reuse a term, and you can see the icon there that indicates sort of recycle, reuse, I can go ahead and change this term as a borrower, so to speak, and it goes back and updates the original term as well. So as an owner, I might not even know that somebody who's reusing one of my terms has made changes to it. So a little tricky, which is why you want to have a governance policy there. It says if you reuse a term, do not make changes without the owner's permission. If you pin a term, which you can kind of see here with North America, that icon there, you can reuse the term, but you can't make changes to it. And see it's grayed out there. That means that the original owner of the term is pretty much assured that nothing's going to happen to his or her term from somebody on the outside. You can still reuse a term, and if I make changes to it as the owner, it'll get changed and trickle down. But I just won't make changes to it. If I make changes to it as I'm not the owner, then it's not going to get changed to the original. So that's maybe a better way to do it. You can also create another label, another term with the same label as a term used elsewhere, which is kind of a nightmare, but maybe you want to do that. It's not going to have the same ID, but it could have the same label. And that could start to wreak havoc with regard to search and reuse, if you want to do terms and navigation. The labels will be the same. The terms themselves technically won't be the same, but they'll look the same to the average user. So you probably want to have a policy and procedure about, don't create when you create a new term, make sure someone else is not using it first. And this goes back to that model we set up, and this goes back to this whole thing about, do you want a lot of control or a little bit of control with regard to your term store. So those are 3 different kind of points here we want to make, where it can get nasty very quickly, which is what we want to avoid by using governance.
I think that shows, these are great examples of why you want to have a governance policy so you don't get in trouble with some of these features. And as Mike was talking, I was just showing with the reuse term, we changed the label, and it shows up here. With the pin term, we couldn't change the label. And here's the copy of the Asia-Pacific term, and I can do whatever I want to it, and it's no longer coupled to the original term. So just some things to be careful of, and I think it's a great illustration of the importance of thinking through some of these things and spending that time up front.
Exactly. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, perfect. And so these are the 10, top 10 terms, our top 10 policies that we think, that we've seen, and we just want to set this up. If you go to the next slide, and I talked about setting up a policy earlier, and I did this in Word, and this is, just a sample. You can go in, and it just basically is set up like a typical policy. It's got steps, process steps, and when to use it, when to not, some guidance, how to use it. And again, this is more or less setting this up in advance and then letting people access this and helping them rather than being sort of a taxonomy dictator and saying you must do it this way or that, because sometimes that doesn't work for people, and they'll just go ahead and, as we've seen, they'll go create their own labels regardless of whether or not they're already set up and controlled, and you've got, you know, term store explosion, whatever you want to call it. So we go to the next one here. I know I'm cognizant we want to get some questions here in the end. So all of this is captured in a guide that I've created that is off our term management site that you can purchase and download. It also includes a lot of videos I've done showing you how to do this with online videos. And also when you get free updates when I update this, which is probably about twice a year, you get the updated version for free included. So anyway, I just wanted to plug that at the end because we've gathered all this sort of knowledge and advice together into one manual that we sell. So now I've left 8 minutes, I guess, for some questions. Mark, unless you've got something you want to address.
I think that's it, and we haven't gotten a huge number of questions. So if you have questions now, it's a good time to put them into the box, and we'll make sure we get you an answer to them. First question, though, is going to relate back to the custom properties that we were looking at. The question was, why did I create a new term set to do this? And I think that it goes back to why create a new term set instead of, or why did I reuse the terms? And the reason for that is, again, this is a good sort of governance scenario, I think, as well. When I originally, in the Manage Metadata 101, I was just interested in tagging content, so I created these location term sets with the idea of tagging those documents. Then as we moved down the line, we decided hypothetically that it would be great to create a site where people could get this content and drive it by managed navigation. I wanted to have a different hierarchy for the navigation of my site than necessarily just by location. But since we had already created these terms, I could reuse them or bring them over from my location term set over to this managed navigation term set. So it's the difference between really a tagging taxonomy and a taxonomy that you're going to use for your site structure. This also illustrates, I think, the benefit of reusing or pinning terms as opposed to copying. If we had just copied North America, the term names would be the same, but the IDs would be different. So when we then went to create these dynamic pages and tried to link it to things that were tagged to Cincinnati or to Denver, it would appear to be the same term. They both say Denver, but they'd have different units in the background, so it may not populate the dynamic content the way we want it to. So I hope that answers. It really speaks to the different purposes of the term set and the value of being able to borrow content from one term set but bring it over into a new term set. And Mike, one question for you. Can you talk about what's the role of the term groups in governance? Is that something people should be thinking about as far as controlling who can actually make changes to the taxonomies?
Yes. So we typically see term groups in companies as sort of the core, like the root, and then term sets typically reflect larger categories, oftentimes business units and groups and things like that. So controlling the term group is something that might be best done at, say, an IT level, and then let those who are familiar with the topics, which would be the term sets, govern those independently. And again, this goes back to the model setup where you might have an HR term set, and then everything, and that's what HR controls. Then they don't control anything else, any other term sets in that term group. I typically like to do it that way. That allows folks to feel a bit more comfortable that someone's not going to go in and start messing around with their term set, which they are the experts on. Right. And yet, at that term group, that highest level, I still want to have IT involved in that because they're the ones that are more the enablers of how the term sets get used across the enterprise. And maybe you want to cordon off, a collection of term sets in a term group and have a separate term group for some other reasons that folks don't necessarily need to see. So sometimes legal likes to have their own cordoned off area, and they don't even want anybody borrowing or touching any of their terms for a bunch of reasons. I get it, right? So sometimes I leave term groups to be basically the core high-level, you've got to have an IT-related reason for setting up a term group separate from the other term sets in your group, you know, like sales, HR, ops, engineering, etc.
So that's great. So we're at the end of the hour, so let's go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank Mike for the great content today. Thank everybody for attending the webinar. As you leave, there'll be a survey, so we'd appreciate if you fill it out. This is new content, just as last week's was new content, so we really value your feedback so we can continue to create valuable webinars for you in the future. With that, thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody, and we look forward to, if you ever need any help with taxonomies or governance, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to work with you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark.